In this video, we are going to put together watch tasks for our server. So, I apologize if we're spending too much time on the build stuff. Like I said before, I've already covered all this stuff before, so I'm kind of moving through it kind of quickly. But for people, again, who haven't used this stuff before, I hope you can immediately see the benefits of doing stuff this way, especially once we play around with this video and put together the watch tasks. Very, very, very simple to do. So what do I mean by a watch task? Well, if I have, let's say, my server open and my build of the server open, it'd be really nice if I can come over here to the source code, make a change, hit Control S, and then automatically have Gulp go out and inform Babel to recompile just this file and put it back on the file system. So that's what we're going to do. And it's really easy, really easy. Watch support is built in to Gulp itself. So we don't need to install any other additional plugins. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say gulp.task, and I'm going to do, I don't know, something like server:watch. And for server:watch, it's going to be a series. So I'm going to open up I'm going to format it like this. And then I'm going to do gulp.series, and we're going to do two things. We are first going to do a build, so that when you invoke server:watch, you'll get a first fresh build. Then I'm going to open up an anonymous function. Actually, I don't really like using the arrow functions for this. Both of these I'm going to change to not use arrow functions, and I'll tell you why. I can actually show you why. If I come here and I do gulp server build, notice the output says, okay, we do a server clean, we finish the server clean, but then we do an anonymous, and then we finish an anonymous. I want to actually name these functions. So you can't name an arrow function. So I'm going to switch this off to using the normal function syntax. And I'm going to do function, but then I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it build. So now, when we come in here and run this, you will see it says it starts server build, starts server clean, finishes clean, starts build, finishes build, and then finishes server build. Actually, maybe compile. Or build. Build is, well, compile. There we go. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I don't know why I didn't think of this in the last video, but I don't know, I just spaced out. But it is something that I want to fix immediately. So for this, we will do a anonymous function called watch. And yes, this is still an anonymous function. It's important to understand that I cannot invoke watch down here. Notice I get an error. That's because when you create an anonymous function with a name, it is simply a named anonymous function. It's still not accessible from anything outside of this scope. Well, I guess it's not anonymous because you can invoke it recursively within the scope. But yeah, I go over all the different ways to define functions and how to distinguish between them in my So You Think You Know JavaScript course, and we talk about that. But the point is I don't really care about invoking this function anywhere else. I just want to give it a name for the output, and that's it. Anyway, this is going to be a really short file. It's or task. It's simply going to return gulp. I'm going to do return gulp dot watch. I'm going to do dot watch / source server, and I'm going to pass in a glob again. And the glob is simply going to select all JavaScript files underneath the source server folder. And then I'm going to pass in a gulp.series of server.build. So what this does is this watches every single JavaScript file inside of my server. And every time one of those files changes or gets added or removed, it will then invoke server build. Now, the second parameter to the .watch method requires that we pass in either gulp series or gulp parallel. I can't just pass in a straight up server build. It will yell at me. So make sure you pass in a gulp series even if you only have one task in that series. But let's go ahead and see what happens when we use this. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to do gulp server:watch. And we'll move this over here and we'll move that over there. So notice how it first invokes the the server build task. So we clean, we compile, and then we start the watch task. But notice how it doesn't stop. So now what I can do is let's go ahead and open up my server side by side with my compiled server. And watch what happens when I change things. Watch what happens when I change ble equals whoa, which is this line right here, to ble equals hello world, and hit Control S. Notice that immediately, almost immediately, it turns into hello world. Hello, and there you go. App component, I can rename to something else. Hit Control S, and now we have our app component has a different name. So now we see with this watch task, we are able to recompile all of our files. Now we do have a slight problem that I just realized, and that is it is running the clean every round. Every time it changes, it runs the clean function, which isn't what we want because, for example, if we have another file called ble.js, and then we say console log hey, the files are still there, but they're both being recompiled. The Gulp changed plugin is not helping at all because it's no longer able to read the timestamps on the files. You can't see it. I was hoping that it would be slow enough to where you could see the build folder disappearing and reappearing, but unfortunately you can't. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to break this out a little bit. I'm going to take this compile function, and I'm going to show you guys how we can compose tasks in a more intelligent way. So I'm going to take the compile function, I'm going to cut it, and then I'm going to paste it, I don't know where to paste it, maybe below server clean, and just leave it as a function. And I'm going to call it compile server. Now you see ESLint is yelling at me because it's not used yet, but otherwise this code is valid. Then inside of my server build Gulp series, I'm going to pass in server clean, but then I'm going to pass in the function compile server. So this is a really cool way that we can compose Gulp tasks as their own functions, and then when we register them with Gulp, we can just pass them in as functions. So then what I'm going to do is on my Gulp task server watch, I'm going to keep the server build where it is so that it gets invoked before the watch. So it will be cleaned. The build folder will be deleted only on the first run of the server watch. But then on the actual watch task itself, when it changes, I'm simply going to pass in compile server. So here's our new updated Gulp file. It's pretty much the same, but I moved this out. Slight oversight on my part, but that's all right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop Gulp because I changed the Gulp file. Every time you change the Gulp file, you have to restart Gulp, which is, yeah, it doesn't automatically reread the Gulp file. So now I'm going to say Gulp server watch. So now watch is running, and now I can open up my server and my other server. And as you see, the build task still works, but what you can't see is the build files folder is no longer being deleted and recreated. And in addition, the gulp.change plugin is going to make sure that it doesn't have to recompile all of the files of the server every time you make one change to one file. Okay. So let's talk about errors, compile errors. There are ways to make your JavaScript not compile, and that is simply by putting in invalid JavaScript. So if I put in a parsing error right here, ESLint parsing error unexpected token, and hit Control S, notice what happens to the watch task. It gives us the error, syntax error in Gulp Babel, gives us the message, gives us the line number, everything's fantastic, except the watch task died. And that's not a desirable thing. We don't want the watch task to stop just because we introduced a syntax error. Syntax errors happen all the time, and having to restart it every time you make one little typo will become very, very annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop over to the gulpfile.babel, and we're going to add some error handling to the Gulp watch task. And all I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to eat the error. I'm going to say on error goes into empty arrow function, and that eats the error. So now when I come back to server, the build task still doesn't complete, unfortunately. It still kills the stream. So let's go ahead and make it stable for now, and then hit Control S. And now for the build file, for the actual build, that will fail. We'll fix that in a moment here. But now when we cause an error in our watch task by creating invalid syntax, it will not just give up and die. As you see, it's still perfectly active. Let's go ahead and fix our actual build task first, though. I'm going to simply copy and paste this on air over to our compile server and right here at the end. So that should also eat the error, in theory anyway. So now if we do server watch, unfortunately we are still running into an error with that. Eating the error should work on Gulp 4. Maybe there was a regression somewhere, but we can worry about that later. Gulp 4 is still obviously in beta, so I don't really care too much. Just make sure you don't have syntax errors when you try to make your first compile, and that's it. You shouldn't anyway. Okay, with that, we have our watch task. Now what I want to do is I want to make it a little bit more interesting. I not only want to have our server be reran or be recompiled every time we hit Control S, I also want our server to be restarted every time there's a new file, or every time there's a change in a file. And there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can use the Nodemon tool that will restart a application on a particular change, or we can use the Gulp Nodemon tool, which will basically do the same thing. We could even use spawn a new task within our Gulp file itself and run our server that way and restart our server that way. I'm going to use the Gulp Nodemon package to do this. So I'm basically going to add another task that will go in and run our server every time the files within our build folder get modified. So to do that, I'm going to say npm install --save gulp nodemon. And you can read the documentation about Nodemon as well, if you are interested in that sort of thing. It has fairly decent documentation on npm and on GitHub. And so this will also install Nodemon as a dependency. And now what I can do is create another task. I'm going to say gulp.task, and it's going to be called server:dev. And that's going to be gulp parallel. Actually, no, it's going to be gulp series. We're going to do a series first. And for the series, we're going to start off with the server build. Then we're going to do a gulp parallel. And in the gulp parallel, I'm going to pass in server watch, as well as function, I'm just going to do Nodemon. And then Nodemon is simply going to say return money.nodemon. And then we're going to pass in options into Nodemon. So what we're doing is when we invoke server dev, the first thing we do is run a build. Then we parallel at the same time run a server watch and also run our Nodemon, which will be watching our files. And for the parameters we're passing into Nodemon, I'm going to say script is /server.js. So that'll be the script that it runs. And then I'm going to say watch is going to be build. So basically what I'm saying is anytime a file changes in the build directory, go ahead and invoke the /server.js file. So now what I'm going to do is come over here, and I'm simply going to say gulp server dev. And that builds, and of course that throws an error. It did get started twice, and that's because the server watch also invokes a server build. Now, the reason it got invoked twice is because, again, the server build happens in a series, which is what we want, but then when we do a gulp parallel, we start the server watch, which also then triggers a build parallel to our Nodemon. So if our Nodemon gets initialized later, or sorry, before the second server build is done, it will invoke our project twice, or our .server.js twice. So to fix that, we need to move our watch method, again, just like what we did before with compile server, we need to move it into its own function. So I'm going to take this watch and I'll put it above our server watch, and I'll call this watch server, and I'll take that and move it down here so that we can invoke the watch server method as its own task internal to Gulp. And then for our gulp.parallel, we will replace that with watch server. Now, when we rerun server dev, we only get one invocation. So now, if I come over here to server, and I change the code to where we're no longer invoking fail, and I run it, we no longer get an error. So now we are running our server as we change our file. So I can say console log hello world, hit Control S, and as you see, hello world is now being printed out within the Gulp file, or within the Gulp task itself. So yeah, I'm going to leave moving around these functions. I usually don't like moving around functions like that on video for the reasons of jumping around a lot kind of makes things confusing. I'm going to leave that in simply because it goes to show how really flexible Gulp is. And when you run into a snag like, oh no, my thing is building twice or being ran twice, how do we debug that and how do we fix it using the Gulp for syntax? But I hope that you guys can see that you can really create complicated workflows with Gulp very, very simply. I suppose, if you can forgive me, I will do one more change to the structure of this file. I'm going to move the compile server function down here, and then I'm going to grab these two, and I'm going to put them down at the bottom. Now, because of function hoisting, I don't need these functions to be in existence, or sorry, be defined before I use them in the gulp.series. And with that, I'll scroll through the Gulp file one more time. Again, I'm leaving the jumping around just because I want to show you guys, I guess it really shows the power of Gulp itself and the ways that we can use it to do awesome things. So with that, we can certainly break these up and make these like one-liners. I'm going to leave them as broken down into multiple lines because I think that's a little bit easier to read. And I think that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to do in this particular video. And we'll see you